Pulavnaka and welcome to For the Record. For the first time ever, Fiji has laws to protect the credit history information of individual Fijians through the Fair Reporting of Credit Act, which was passed in the last sitting of Parliament. What this basically means is that records that were kept over the last few years of credit and loans taken out by individuals has now been quarantined. It cannot be used for any purposes whatsoever moving forward as the Act comes into force. This has led to some repercussions in the business community, especially among banks and hire purchase businesses. But it has also meant that Fijians will now, going forward, be able to get loans without having a sort of chip on their shoulder. But to talk about the Fair Reporting of Credit Act, I have with me tonight the Chief Executive of the Consumer Council of Fiji, Ms. Premila Kumar. Premila, thank you very much for being here tonight. Let's address the elephant in the room. The banks and hire purchase sector are saying that the Fair Reporting of Credit Act basically means that they as a business cannot assess the ability of an individual to come through on their commitment to pay a loan or to pay for a product that they have applied for.
My question to them would be, the Data Bureau came into existence in 2001. Doesn't mean that the banks and hire purchase companies in Fiji started operating the business in 2001. They were there previously, and how were they assessing the loans then? Even till now, the application form for loan has got certain sections where consumers or the borrowers have to disclose the credit they have taken from other sources. And Data Bureau did provide an important service where they provided the credit history, which was only for verification purposes. So, having said that, what I'm saying is, even the application form they have is good enough for them to do the assessment.
Let's talk about the Fair Reporting of Credit Act itself. Now, as I explained earlier, it basically means that Data Bureau, which was the sole entity that provided this service of collecting credit history of individuals, all its information has now been locked away, so to speak, or will be once the Act comes into force. So what does that mean for average Fijians?
It simply means that an average Fijian will be able to go to the bank and can still apply for the loan without being victimized, because previously our concern has always been that the data that was collected were wrongful and it did not contain correct information. So now, with the legislation in place, it simply means that credit provider and the credit agency, they'll be both responsible for ensuring that the data they collect is correct. So previously with the Data Bureau being in place, if the name goes in, it stays there for 7 years. And the consumer who wants to go and borrow the money is told by the bank officer or the loans officer that your name is in the Data Bureau. And then the dispute starts. And everything left on the borrower or the consumer to go and sort it out. In other words, who put the name there? Why the name is on that Data Bureau? That information is not communicated with the consumer. It's only at the time of the loan they come to know about this information.
Well, I mean, the banks, and the hire purchase organizations would say that this individual does owe money, and if you owe money by law, by right, you should pay up.
Exactly, you should, and we're not denying that. There are two things that I want to clarify here. One is that if a borrower has taken money, consumer has taken money, you got to pay that money, right? And secondly, credit agency, they do play an important role. We're not denying that. We need a credit agency, but not a credit agency that self-regulates. A credit agency that operates under a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that, yes, we are collecting information from third parties, but I'm sorry, we're not taking responsibility for this data. And yet you're making money. You know, each member who is loading the information on the Data Bureau pays an annual subscription. Any consumer who is victimized goes to Data Bureau to understand the problem. They have to pay $20 to get a report. So you are making money by storing all this data, but you don't want to take responsibility for the information? That's not on. So what we want is a legislation like what was passed last week to set the ground rules so that all the three parties, that is the credit provider, the credit agency, and the report recipients, they are all held responsible. And that's precisely what the legislation does.
But why remove all the data that has been collected and that exists now?
Okay, why remove it? There are a couple of things that I want to raise here. The first one is, how was the data collected? Data Bureau and its members can say, yes, we were taking consent. My argument to them is, tell us, how did you take consent from some consumers whose names appear in the Data Bureau from the time when the Data Bureau did not even exist? How did you get those consent? Can they prove it? We had written to Data Bureau, and the only response we got on this one was that we are trying to strengthen the code of conduct. Is that good enough for a consumer? Then there was another case where a small claims tribunal had dismissed the case, and yet the details were uploaded on the Data Bureau. So why should a consumer be given a runaround? Where is the responsibility of the credit provider who loads the information and the reporting agency that makes money by selling this personal information? Somebody must be held accountable for this. And we cannot allow a credit agency to work on its own. We had to have certain ground rules, and finally, through this particular legislation, the ground rules have been set.
Of course, there's some new frameworks that have come in and regulatory requirements where the Reserve Bank is now the governing agency for all credit information. But going back to the point of the information that exists being taken away, let me play the devil's advocate. If I am a bank and somebody comes and asks for $1 million in loan, I want to know the credit history of that person. Has that person been able to pay? I don't have that anymore. I can't do that.
Exactly. I cannot really comment on that whole procedure. As I have said, our idea was to have ground rules. Now, if the reporting, if the Fair Reporting of Credit Act says that the data cannot be used, there must be a reason for it. The reason is that some of this data were tainted, as I had given you the two examples, right? Now you are saying that the banks want to give loan. I'm saying yes, there is a disclosure on the part of the borrower to disclose all the information, and that's when the banks can do a bit of cross-checking by making a call to those agencies to find out. You know, when we're talking about $1 million loan, they can do that. They can verify that. Because Data Bureau obviously played an important role by keeping the credit history, right? But we are saying that some of this credit history were not correct. So with this new law, how can they carry forward the same credit history? It defeats the whole purpose. That information needs cleansing. It needs tidying up so that it complies with the new law. And the new law says that you got to take consent from a consumer before his or her credit, his or loans or whatever is loaded on the Data Bureau.
Okay, and with that, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Good evening, welcome back to the show. We're speaking with Premila Kumar, the Chief Executive of the Consumer Council of Fiji, and the topic tonight is the Fair Reporting of Credit Act, which was recently passed in Parliament. Premila, the banks came out, as the act was passed in Parliament, they came out with a statement, the Association of Banks in Fiji, to say that this makes business very difficult for them and that there will be repercussions on consumers. One, that the loans application process will be more cumbersome now because the banks will have to do more due diligence, and interest rates are likely to go up because there is no way of assessing an individual or people's credit history. So in effect, this may have negative effect on Fijians, this act here?
Not really. It's a threat they're using, and we've seen that happening. After all, it's their own personal interest is at stake. Because if you look at the shareholders of Data Bureau, it's the financial institutions and insurance companies who own that Data Bureau. And obviously, Data Bureau was generating millions of dollars for them. So, and again, making profit, there is nothing wrong with it. But making profit on tainted data, it is wrong. And operating a business under disclaimer, it is wrong. That's what we are saying. Now, the two issues they have raised, one is the interest rate will go up, and secondly, they've also mentioned that it will be difficult for them to assess. This particular legislation is not saying that you can't operate a credit agency. They can start the credit agency. Anyone, for that matter, can start the credit agency by going to Reserve Bank and meeting all the requirements. The banks can also do the same. So it is not stopping anyone. It doesn't mean that this legislation has come in and therefore there is no credit agency ever will be set up in Fiji. Maybe Data Bureau or shareholders do not want to set up a credit agency, it's their call, but there would be others who may be interested. So it will be there. This is the interim measure because we have to have the ground rules, and for that reason the banks and other financial institutions will cry foul, and we can hear that because it is their own personal stake, that they had this interest in Data Bureau, and the removal of the data, or we would say the existence of Data Bureau, because it has to comply with the new law, is definitely hurting them. So the only way they can justify now is by saying that, you know what, we're going to increase the interest rate, or it's going to take longer to approve. Now you tell me, we have been handling cases for financial institutions as well. Are you saying that they approve the loan overnight? No, they have been sitting on it for months, even after having Data Bureau. So that's not a good enough justification. Regarding increasing the interest rate, as it is for some consumers who were bad borrowers, they had to pay higher interest rate. So it makes no difference. And then it's not going to be there forever, as I have said, because there is an opportunity now for anyone to start their credit agency, and that will bring about competition in the market.
I sent some questions to the chairman of Data Bureau, Mr. Gary Callahan, and he has responded. One was the allegation that Data Bureau's operations are being run arbitrarily. Mm-hmm. And he has denied this, and he is saying that the claims made against Data Bureau are incorrect and based on ignorance. What do you have to say to this?
Well, let me tell him that the Consumer Council of Fiji has been meeting Data Bureau from 2006. And we went through all their documents, all their policies. I had one-to-one meeting with them. And at that time, Data Bureau were registering names, and the names were locked up for 10 years. And we, in fact, told them that this is wrong. If the government or the state simply says that your information, you got to keep the information for 7 years, we question them, how come you're above the law and you're keeping information for 10 years? That's when they agreed to reduce it to 7 years. But there were other systemic issues which was of major concern for us. Like, for example, the Complaints Committee. Complaints Committee were not independent. They were the judge and the jury.
How can you prove that they had records dating back 10 years? What evidence do you have?
We had the evidence because the consumer's name appeared. We had one-to-one discussion. They've also told us that they will reduce it from 10 years to 7 years. All correspondence are there with us. So what else, what other type of evidence do you want? Mm-hmm. And again, going back to the point that you had sent a question and they're responding, why aren't they here sitting next to me?
Well, in all justification, we made the approach and we may have been late I may have been late in getting in touch with the Data Bureau, so Mr. Callahan had to leave
But
the
you were-
country.
okay.
He had to catch a flight, so I'm not going to
Okay.
hold that against him, and I don't think it's fair for us to say that right now,
Okay.
because he has responded to the questions. We emailed it to him. The other thing he says is that the number of people with outstanding defaults loaded onto Data Bureau is less than 10%. The majority of their information, which is 90% of consumers and borrowers in Fiji, have had their good credit history wiped out. I mean, as I said earlier, we are doing more harm than good.
Well, that's what he's saying. As I have said, we don't have access to the Data Bureau data. But what we are saying is, looking at some of the cases that we have handled, it's a clear indication that the data that we're collecting was tainted. And I've given you a couple of examples previously. Now, how can we be sure? And it is for this reason this legislation will make sure that the information they have is absolutely correct. And that 90% data that he's saying is not tainted and it's a good data, perhaps they have to talk to Reserve Bank and carry forward those data. I don't know. But that is for the regulator and for them to sort it out. But forget about this 90 and 10%. I mean, of course, it's a crucial part of the discussion. But the other point is they're collecting personal information. And personal information such as date of birth, where I live, who is my employer, what is my passport number. I mean, these are privacy issues. Who should be taking responsibility of this privacy information in case this information lands in wrong hands with cybercrime, with identity theft? Who should be taking responsibility? Should we go back to Data Bureau and say, you know what, you kept our information and therefore you'll be responsible for it? I strongly believe, based on the Constitution, the state has to take that responsibility, and that's precisely what they're doing through this particular law.
All right, we'll take another break. We'll be back shortly. Good evening, welcome back to the show. We're speaking about the Fair Reporting of Credit Act, and our guest is the Chief Executive of the Consumer Council of Fiji, Ms. Premila Kumar. Premila, you mentioned before the break the need for privacy and to protect individual Fijians' information. Do you expect, I suppose this would be coming from the Reserve Bank, do you expect there to be more detailed regulations coming out in terms of what information can be stored and what can't be stored, looking at what is contained in the Act?
Well, looking at the Act itself, the Act just gives the framework. But the nitty-gritty of how the data will be assessed or recorded and what can go in, what should not be recorded, would be through a regulation, right? And to what extent the data information should be collected about a person. I think that framework will be set by the Reserve Bank. And we can see from the privacy perspective, there are certain provisions within the Act where they have to audit the data. So auditing process is where the company or any credit agency needs to say what security measures were there in place and how can they ensure or prove that the data they collected was correct. So all that has to go in the compliance report. So it simply means that the security measure that we are talking about in case of a breach in privacy, then that's the point where Reserve Bank can always go back to the credit agency by saying that you have to up your security measures. So there would be continuous improvement in security measures, making sure that best practices are used, and that will give protection to the public. At the moment, we don't know what security measures. They may be having the best measures, but you need that kind of information to be guarded by an external party and not by themselves.
Can you explain to your consumers, of
Yes.
whom you are a champion in this regard, that their loans have not been wiped out? Because there are some people out there who think that the Bureau is gone, I don't have to pay my loans.
Actually, we made that statement immediately after this act was passed. We had issued a press release. We had clearly stated to consumers that removal not really removal, but the passing of this particular act does not mean that your loans have been taken off. In fact, this legislation only looks at the credit history. Taking a loan simply means that you've taken money or you borrowed money from banks and other financial institution or hire purchase company. That you have to continue. Consumers have to pay that loan. But with this particular act, it only deals with the credit history. So there is no credit history at the moment. But of course, the banks have got all the records of the loan they have given to an individual. And if consumers think that with this particular act they don't have to pay the loans, then they're heading the wrong way. What I mean by that is they will be given default notices, the houses can go on mortgagee sale, they can be reposition of the goods, and they can get into more financial hardship. So consumers got to honor the loan agreement, they must continue their payment, and the credit history bit, they should just leave it to the regulator and the credit agency. It has nothing to do with them, for that matter, till it gets all tidied up.
Isn't there the possibility or the fear that people may become lax in paying their loans because their credit history will not be affected because there is no credit history?
Even if there is no credit history, as I have said, for time being, interim measure, there is no credit history. But the loans were already taken. And the banks already have the credit history, they've seen the credit history, that's how they gave the loan. So it's a question of the consumer making sure that they pay that loan. It doesn't mean when you took the loan, the banks did not have your credit history. Of course they've got the credit history, right? But it's only the new loan approval would be something that the banks have to do extra work to establish that the person who is applying for the loan has got a better record. But for the existing loan accounts, the consumers should continue paying those loans.
Well, one of the other problems is the hire purchase sector. We've spoken about banks to some degree, but when it comes to buying items on hire purchase, a lot of people, they make payments and they stop. And so something like Data Bureau is a sort of respite for hire purchase businesses, which can log in the details of a person who hasn't been making payments and say, look, this person owes us X amount of money. We've been sending him notices. He's not paid for the item which he's still got. Don't process his loans until he's cleared his account. We're talking about running a business here.
Yes, yes. You are meddling two things here. One is the credit history, which is under this new legislation. The other one is the Consumer Credit Act, which guides the consumer and the businesses how the loan should be given. Now, if a consumer, say for some reason, is unable to pay, right, there is also provision in the legislation which the financial institutions or hire purchase company must look into if there is a hardship, etc. There are certain provision to cover that. But the only crux of the matter that I see with this particular legislation coming into play is the bit where the loan approval needs to be done. But then again, my argument is that there is a form a consumer has to fill and declare. And when they declare, they can cross-check.
So
get the information.
Credit history and all the data is only relevant at the point at which the application is being made.
Correct.
Not
later on.
Not later on, not when the payments are being made. Okay, we'll take another break. We'll be back very soon. Good evening and welcome back. Pramila, before the break we were talking about hire purchase businesses. Let me make the point that hire purchase businesses, operators, were members of Data Bureau and they did enter said information about their customers into the Data Bureau software. So, you're talking about separating the Fair Reporting of Credit Act against the Consumer Rights Act, but herein doesn't seem to merge, doesn't seem to balance off.
Actually, we are confusing ourselves here. The Data Bureau was providing a essential service where they were giving the credit history of a person before a loan is given. So that credit history assisted any financial institution to make a decision whether that financial institution wants to give a loan or not. That's the purpose. Once the loan is given, then the Consumer Credit Act is there to guide the financial institution as well as the consumer in terms of making that repayments, how the disclosure should be there, how the interest should be calculated. So all the other information comes later on. And again, even with the credit history, one can have the best credit history, but what can happen in your life, nobody can see that. You can go into some financial hardship. It can happen. That doesn't mean your credit history is so bad now. So what I'm saying, out of all these years, like you making good payments and everything, and one such incident should not tarnish a person's image, you know. So for the banks or financial institutions to make their decision, as I've said earlier on, only thing they will now rely on is the application form and the disclosure on the part of the consumer, what he or she discloses. And that becomes a legal document. And loan recovery can happen through other means, not necessarily, because, you know, one of the other problem that we had and we saw, the way the Credit Data Bureau members were putting advertisement, you pick up any utility bills, you pick up anything, they're saying, okay, if you're not going to pay, we will load your name onto Data Bureau. Data Bureau became a big threat, even for good consumers. I mean, why should we hear that crap from these companies threatening us that if you don't pay, we'll put your name on the Data Bureau?
Oh, there is a legal obligation on part of the consumer to pay.
Exactly, because the Data Bureau is meant to be providing credit history. It is not a sort of a debt recovery center.
Are you saying it became a power unto itself?
On itself, yeah, absolutely, because there was no ground rules, there was no nothing to guide them.
Now that we have ground rules, Premila,
yes.
Data Bureau as of now, as we speak, may not operate according to correspondence from owners of Data Bureau. Their intellectual property, which they say is the information that has been loaded by members, is being taken away, and they won't be able to operate. But with the governing laws and regulations which are coming in, how does one go about running such a business? So I can go to Reserve Bank and I can say, here are my credentials, I want to run a credit reporting agency. Is that what's going to happen?
Exactly. And it's now an open market. Previously it was a monopoly. We just had one credit agency, and that credit agency did what it wanted to do based on their own terms and conditions. They had their own code of conduct for its members. They continued operating under disclaimer. They were not taking any ownership of any errors, because that's what the disclaimer says. But now, with the Fair Reporting of Credit Act, any business can apply for a license at Reserve Bank, and they can start operating a credit agency based on the terms and conditions set by the Reserve Bank. So not necessarily we'll have just one credit agency. We can have many more credit agencies in this country. So it's an open market now.
Don't you think there is a risk, given the fact that so many years of credit history, let's say the last 7 years of credit history of a large number of people no longer exists? Isn't there some sort of risk to lenders, to hire purchase businesses?
Well, I think I have mentioned it previously that some of this data were tainted. So why use the same tainted data?
But how much of the data? It can't be all that bad.
Exactly. Who has been watching those data? Who has been looking at that data? When Data Bureau itself says through a disclaimer that we're not taking any responsibility for the third party input, then who should take the responsibility? Somebody else got to take that responsibility. And this is where the state has come in and said, okay, if Data Bureau cannot take responsibility, credit credit providers cannot take any responsibility, well, let's give this responsibility to Reserve Bank That's precisely what has happened.
But Data Bureau has been successful in getting loans repaid, in having money that was owed be paid up. It has worked. That's one of the successes of the business itself.
Not only going to the Data Bureau really meant paying off. One used to take the cases to Small Claims Tribunal through the court system. There are so many other mechanisms through which debt can be recovered. It's not only through Data Bureau.
But it works. Obviously, it works.
No,
it
does.
Has a membership.
People,
businesses are entering the information, and obviously they must have some faith in Data Bureau, in the ability to recoup their monies.
Of course, there is nothing wrong in recouping their money. But what I'm saying is, if you've got a wrong information there, and if I'm going to go and apply for a loan and I'm told that, you know what, you owe all this money, which I haven't, because even wrongful listing has taken place, where I didn't owe any money to nobody and my name appears. And that also means that by the time you go and get a report, and what Data Bureau will tell you, well, we cannot assist you here, but you need to go and see the credit provider who had listed the name on the Data Bureau. In other words, you go and sort it out with them.
So it was running from post to pillar.
Exactly. So you run to that particular agency will say no for this reason. Then they come to the council, then we intervene and we ask for all the verification, prove it to us that this person owed money. Then ultimately the name was taken off. So Data Bureau here was like really sitting independently because they were operating under disclaimer. And they would simply say that you just have to go to the credit provider and sort it out with them. And once the member, Data Bureau's member, will inform Data Bureau that yes, it was a wrongful listing, then only they will remove it from the Data Bureau.
All information in the database is entered by the members. Data Bureau has never loaded information into the database.
Correct.
Well, that's coming from Data Bureau itself.
And we agree with that they don't enter, but they sell that information. They make money out of it. Should they not be responsible for this information? That's the question.
Okay, we'll take another break. We'll be back shortly. Good evening, welcome back. We're just about wrapping up the show for tonight, but we'll continue discussions with Ms. Premila Kumar, the Chief Executive of the Consumer Council of Fiji, and we're talking about the Fair Reporting of Credit Act. Premila, how many complaints have you seen against Data Bureau?
We have seen 47 complaints, but these 47 complaints are where the complainants came in, they filled in a form, complaints form, they've signed on it, they gave us the right to get information from Data Bureau, etc. But while assessing those 47 complaints, like for example, one complaint is why my name is there for 10 years when I've already paid my money. So that's when, as a complaint from a complainant, we took this matter to Data Bureau, had a discussion that why are you putting someone's name for 10 years? And that's when the number of years came down. So it was a systemic issue. It simply means that everyone's name will be there for 10 years.
You're saying 47 complaints since 2008.
Correct.
Data Bureau is saying 14 issues, 14 complaints in 15 years.
They can say what they like, but I can tell you...
All issues have been resolved because the complaints were not valid in the first place.
They will say that. Who wants regulation? They have to defend themselves by saying that, you know, we have received 14 complaints. We have got names of people, the addresses, their phone numbers, the nature of complaints, all that we have in our office. And we had to share that information with the ministry as well. But having said this, these 47 complaints that we are talking about, and they're saying only 14 complaints, look at the disclaimer. What are they saying in the disclaimer? They're simply saying that, you know, we're not taking any responsibility for the accuracy of the information that is put on it. Why would consumers want to go to Data Bureau? Because after all, they will say, you know what, we can't take responsibility. We told you under this disclaimer, you have to now go and see the credit provider.
I'm quoting Gary Callahan, the chairman of Data Bureau. Data Bureau, for those who may not be aware, is the sole agency in Fiji which ran this credit history business. Its future, as of now, remains in doubt. But we sent questions to Mr. Callahan. The reality is that the Consumer Council sees itself as the champion of very few people in Fiji who repeatedly fail to pay their debt.
Absolutely wrong. If we had to support that, we wouldn't be issuing statements and in fact working in favor of the financial institutions by educating the consumers about their loans and why they need to pay. We have been doing that work for them. And for that reason, let me tell you, we have set up a debt management unit at Consumer Council, basically assisting the consumers to pay their debt. So we are doing work for the financial institution and at the same time saving the consumer's interest. So they cannot make that statement.
He also makes the point that small businesses will be affected. Small businesses which have consumers who owe them money. Okay. It's harder for smaller businesses to survive when people don't pay up.
Very interesting, small businesses. How many small businesses are the members of Data Bureau? You should ask him. There is a list. You don't see small businesses, you only see the giants there. So what is he talking about? How many small businesses? Because membership fee is not easy either. It's not cheap to be a member of Data Bureau.
Lastly, Premila, the law is in place now. From the Consumer Council perspective, it sets a new framework going forward for people who want to take out loans, who want to buy items on hire purchase. How should they now move forward, bearing in mind that there is no credit history? Fair enough, but there is still responsibility on the consumer.
Oh, absolutely. And the responsibility on the credit provider to assess the loan application and then make an informed decision whether he or she wants to give loan or not. So the responsibility is on both the party, the borrowers and the credit providers. So in this situation where they don't have a credit history, as I have said, is the application form and the disclosure on the part of the consumer is very important. And we have been also educating the consumers that you must live within your means. If you don't have the money and you know that your financial situation is such that you can't make the payment, why take loan?
All right, Premila, with that we have to wrap up tonight's show. Thank you very much for coming.
My pleasure.
And that was our show for this evening. I must point out that we had attempted to get in touch with the chair of Data Bureau, Mr. Gary Callahan, and it was unfortunate that he was unable to attend because he had to catch a flight out of Fiji, but he did make the effort to reply via email to some of the questions that we sent him. And that wraps up tonight's episode of For the Record. We'll be back again next Sunday, but up next is the My Say segment. Until next weekend from me, good night.